The morning after they buried Tom Kessler, a man in a gray suit stood on Iris Kessler's porch with a check and a pen. He laid the check down flat. He laid it right over the funeral home guest book, the one still damp from the night before. The ink of all those signatures not even dry. Iris didn't cry when he said the number. She looked at that check the way you'd look at a wet leaf blown onto clean linen. He'd already taken 3 porches on this street the same way. I know what he told his people, because I heard it later, in his own words. Widows sign faster than they read. Grief does half my job for me. 9 houses on Elm Street. He meant to have every one of them before the maples turned. What Mr. Voss didn't know is that my Harlan surveyed this street with his own 2 hands in 1949. And there was a trunk in my hall closet I hadn't opened since the funeral. I'll tell you what was in it. But not yet. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. My name is Ruth Ackerman, and I lived at the far end of Elm Street for 41 years. Before I go on, do me one kindness. Subscribe, so a story like this can find the next person who needs it. And in the comments, tell me the name of the street you grew up on. Just the name. I want to see how far Elm Street travels. Go on. I'll wait. Then come back and sit with me a while, because you'll want to hear how this one ends. Now, let me start where it started. Merrow Creek, Ohio, late summer 1972. If you drove through, you might not have slowed down. We were 9 narrow houses set under old maples, on the north edge of town, cut out of what used to be the Pettigrew farm. The lots were skinny, the porches were deep. In August, the trees met over the road, so the whole street went green and cool, like walking under water. The men built those houses themselves, not all at once. A little every year, a little when there was money. My Harlan was the county surveyor, so he set the corners for the whole block. He drove the stakes. He drew the plat. Tom Kessler ran the linotype down at the Merrow Creek Register for 30 years, and his fingers were always a little gray from the lead. Cal Bellamy was foreman at the brickworks, and half the brick on this street came home in the bed of his truck, one careful load at a time, all of it paid for square. They're mostly gone now, the men. That's the thing nobody tells you about a street like this. You don't notice it happening. One winter it's Cal. Then it's a spring, and it's my Harlan, quiet in his chair with the radio on. Then a summer, and it's Tom. And what's left on the porches, up and down the block, is the women. I want you to understand what these women gave. Because a man in a gray suit looked at us and saw easy money. He saw old and alone. He did not see what I'm about to tell you. Odessa Pryor kept the brickworks books through the whole war while Cal's brother was overseas, and raised 2 boys doing it. And never once was a nickel off. Marta Bellamy took in sewing by the porch light until her eyes gave out, because Cal's foreman pay didn't stretch, and pride wouldn't let her say so. Iris Kessler worked the night shift at the canning plant for 11 years, so Tom's register wages could go straight onto the house note. That mortgage got paid a nickel at a time, sometimes less. I remember the month it was pennies rolled in paper. These were not helpless women. They were the ones who did the arithmetic when the men were too tired. They were the ones who made $1 do the work of 2. Every board on this street had a woman's whole life pressed into it. And on every mantel, in every front room, there was a little tin cigar box. Inside each box, folded soft as cloth from all the years, was the deed. The paper that said this is ours. We bled for it, and it's ours. My mother-in-law kept hers in a box that once held King Edward's. Iris kept hers in a Prince Albert tin. We laughed about it once, that the deeds to Elm Street all smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. It seems like a small thing. Hold on to it. It won't stay small. There's one more thing in my house I have to tell you about, because I promised. Harlan's survey trunk. A big black steamer trunk, with brass corners, standing in the dark of the hall closet behind the winter coats. His whole working life was in there. His field books, his transit, his maps. After he passed, I shut that closet door, and I did not open it again. I told myself I never would. Some griefs you can carry. That trunk was one I set down. Now hold that. The trunk in the closet. We'll get back to it. It was the second week of September when the gray suit first came to Elm Street. He came to Odessa Pryor's door, and Odessa was the right one to start with if you were a fool, and the wrong one if you were anything else. I was in my garden, pinching the last of the tomatoes, and I heard the car before I saw it. A new car. You could tell by the sound, that soft, expensive hush a new engine makes. It pulled up at Odessa's, and a man got out. Younger than my sons. He had a good haircut and a briefcase, and he moved the way a man moves when he thinks the day already belongs to him. He knocked. Odessa came to the screen. I couldn't hear all of it from where I stood, but a September afternoon carries sound down a quiet street, and I heard enough. Just concerned for you is all, he was saying. A place this size, all those taxes, and a woman on her own. Odessa didn't say anything. That was Odessa. The county's talking about a highway spur, he said. Right through here. Now, nobody wants to say it out loud, but property like this, once that goes through, well, he let it sit. $7,800, cash, this week. You'd never have to worry about a tax bill again. $7,800. For a house worth $18 if it was worth a dime. I knew what those houses were worth. I'd lived my whole life next to a man who valued land for the county, and I heard him say the numbers over supper for 40 years. Odessa Pryor looked at that young man through her screen door. Then she shut it. Not hard at first. She shut it slow, so he could watch it close. And then, when the latch caught, she gave the wood one good slap with the flat of her hand that cracked down the street like a rifle. He stood a second on the empty porch. Then he got in his fine, quiet car and drove down to the next house. I should have known then. I did know, in the part of me that keeps books. But knowing and doing are two different animals, and it took me too long to close the gap. That night I did the one thing I knew how to do. I wrote him a note. I found his card, Crescent Development Group, it said. Mr. Delvos, Acquisitions. And I sat at my kitchen table under the tube radio, and I wrote to him in my good hand. I told him what I knew that he did not. I told him Elm Street was not 9 houses. I told him it was one plat, surveyed and recorded as a single parcel back when it was cut from the Pettigrew farm, and that a man who understood land would understand there were things about it he could not simply buy one door at a time. I was polite. Harlan raised me polite. I signed it, Mrs. Harlan Ackerman, and I walked it down to the boarding house where they said he was staying, and I left it with the desk. I found out later what he did with it. He read the first line. Then he set it in the wastebasket by the door without finishing it. An old woman's note. That's all it was to him. He told the boy at the desk to throw it out. I want you to remember that note. Remember that I warned him, in writing, and that he threw it away. That's going to matter more than either of us knew. The next one he took was Marta Bellamy, and he took her clean, and it was my fault as much as anybody's, because I didn't see how thin she'd worn until it was already done. It was Marta's pension. Cal's Brickworks pension came the same day every month. And Marta ran her life to the width of it, right to the edge. And that month the check bounced. Something at the works, some paperwork, some new man in the office who didn't know Cal Bellamy from a fence post. The check came back, and Marta had already paid the grocer and the coal man ahead on the strength of it, the way you do when you've never once been let down in 30 years. Delvos knew. I don't know how he knew, but he knew. That kind of man makes it his business to know which check bounced and whose. He was on her porch the same week, and this time he brought another man with him, a soft, heavy man with a lawyer's satchel, to stand there and make it look official. To make Marta feel like it was a real thing happening. A serious thing, a thing you couldn't back out of. $8,400, he told her. And the taxes, he told her. And the highway, he told her. And a woman alone, he told her. And here is a man of the law to see it done proper. Marta signed. She signed the papers on her own porch rail with his pen, and she was so ashamed she never told a soul. Not me. Not Odessa. Not anybody. She just went inside and shut the door and sat in Cal's chair in the dark. Here's what I didn't know, and what she didn't understand herself. She signed the first page. Just the first page. She thought she'd sold her house. She hadn't. But we'll come to that. For now, know only this. Marta thought she was gone. Marta thought Elm Street was already breaking, and she was the crack. And the shame of it kept her mouth shut when we needed it open. Did she sell it? Hold that question. Hold it right in the front of your mind. It's a door that hasn't finished opening. Then came Tom. Tom Kessler had a bad heart for years, and everybody knew it and nobody said it. Which is how a street handles a thing like that. He went in his sleep, which is the only mercy in the whole business, and we buried him on a Thursday, with the whole block in the churchyard and half the town besides. Tom set the type for the register for 30 years. There wasn't a person in Marrow Creek who hadn't read something his fingers had built. The funeral home set out a guest book on a little stand, the way they do, and everyone signed it, line after line of names in every kind of hand. Iris kept it. She brought it home and set it on the hall table, still open, the last page still soft with ink, because a widow the first night can't bear to close the book with her husband's name in it. And the very next morning, before the flowers on the grave had even wilted, Del Vos came up the walk. I was on my porch. It was early and cool, and the light came slantwise down the street the way it does in September. Honey-colored, catching the dust. I saw him park. I saw him take the check out of the envelope and look at it and put it back, the way a man checks his lines before a play. And I saw him climb Iris Kessler's steps the morning after we put her husband in the ground. And this time the whole street saw, because we were all out. That's the thing he never understood about us. The morning after a funeral, a street like ours doesn't hide inside. We come out onto our porches. We sit where we can see each other. We don't say much. We just make sure the new widow is not alone in the world, by sitting where she can look up and see a neighbor on every porch. Odessa was out. Marta was out, ashamed as she was. I was out. All of us, up and down Elm Street, in the morning light, watching. Voss knocked. Iris came to the door in her housecoat, and she hadn't slept. You could see she hadn't slept. He said his soft things. And then he laid the check down on the hall table. He laid it right over the open guest book, right over all those names. Over Tom's mourners. He set his money down on top of the town's grief like it was a coaster, and he uncapped his pen and held it out. Iris looked at that check. She didn't cry. I told you that at the start, and I'll tell you again, because it's the truest thing I know about that morning. She looked at it the way you'd look at a wet leaf blown onto clean linen. Something that did not belong. Something you would want to lift off with 2 fingers and drop over the rail. She took the pen. God help me, she took the pen. Her hand was on the paper. And down the street, on every porch, not one of us moved. Because what do you do? What do you say? It's her house, and her grief, and her pen. And then Odessa Pryor stood up. She didn't shout. Odessa never shouted. She just stood up out of her chair, slow, so the porch board spoke under her, and she stood there at her rail, looking straight at Iris's door. And then Marta stood. And then, God forgive me for how long it took, I stood. And one by one, all down Elm Street, the widows of the men who built the place stood up on their own porches in their morning housecoats and looked at that door. We didn't say a word. We just stood. Iris felt it. You feel a thing like that. She looked up from the check, and she saw us, every one of us on our feet, and something came back into her face that the check had pushed out. She set the pen down on the table. She picked the check up by one corner, the way you'd lift that wet leaf, and she held it out to him without a word. He had to take it back or let it fall. He took it back. And he went down the steps with his check in his hand and his jaw tight, and he got in his car. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. It was the morning I learned who I was dealing with. Because I had to go to town that afternoon. I walked down to the diner on Main to pick up a prescription from the drugstore 2 doors down, and there was a big dark car parked at the curb outside the diner, engine running, and Del Voss standing at the window of it, with his hat in his hand like a boy called to the principal. I don't eavesdrop. My mother would rise from her grave. But the window was down, and the voice inside carried, and it was an older man's voice, smooth and sure of itself, a voice that had never once worried about a bounced check in its life. Voss's boss. I found out his name later. Cyrus Gaines. The principal of Crescent Development Group, in from the city to see why his errand boy hadn't finished the job. And I stood there in the shade of the drugstore awning with my empty basket, and I heard Cyrus Gaines say it. Clear as a church bell. You're making it hard, Del. It's not hard. Widows sign faster than they read. Grief does half your job for you. A little laugh. The kind of laugh that costs a person nothing. Get me Elm Street by October. All 9. The chain won't touch it unless it's the whole block, and I've got a promotion riding on that parcel. So stop losing to housewives on porches and get me my deeds. The window went up. The car pulled out. And I stood there so long the druggist came out to see if I was all right. Grief does half my job for me. I walked home the whole way with those words going around in me like a stone in a shoe. Because he was right, wasn't he? That's the part that burned. He was right about us. We had let grief make us soft and small and quiet. Odessa's spine was the only reason Iris still had her house that morning, and Odessa's spine was one woman's, and one woman is not a street. He'd take us one at a time. He'd wait for the next bounce check, the next fresh grave, the next weak morning, and he'd be on the porch with his pen before the flowers wilted. He had until October. And there were more than enough weak mornings between now and October. I came in my kitchen door, and I set my basket down, and I stood in my own front hall, and I looked at the hall closet. I had let grief set that trunk down. My grief, my quiet, my too old and too alone. Same grief he was counting on. Same lock he knew how to pick. I opened the closet. I pushed the winter coats aside. And for the first time since we buried Harlan, I knelt down in front of that black steamer trunk with the brass corners, and I opened the lid. It smelled like him. That's the first thing. Pipe smoke and cedar and the machine oil he kept his transit in. I had to sit a minute with that. Grief is not a straight road, and I went down a side lane of it right there on the closet floor, with my hand on his folded work coat. Then I made myself look. His field books were on top, the little leather ones he filled with his cramped surveyor's numbers, one for every job he ever ran. His transit in its fitted case. Rolled maps standing on end. And under all of it, in a flat oilcloth folder tied with string, the old papers. The papers he kept because he was a man who understood that land remembers. I untied the string. And there, brown and brittle and beautiful, was the original deed to the Pettigrew farm. 1890-something, the whole quarter section, before it was ever a street. And folded with it, in the founder's own careful copperplate, was the founding grant. The document that broke the farm into lots and made Elm Street a place. I nearly folded it back up. It was old. It was history. It wasn't going to save anybody. And then my eye caught a line, low on the second page, and my breath went out of me. I'm going to read it to you the way it read to me, kneeling on that closet floor in the last of the afternoon light. It said the lots hereby created shall not be consolidated, nor conveyed for commercial development, save by the written consent of all owners of record. All owners of record. I read it 3 times. Then I sat back on my heels and I understood, and understanding came into me like cold water and hot at the same time. All owners. Not most. Not 7 of 9. Not a majority. All, every single deed on Elm Street had that founding grant standing behind it, because every deed was cut from it. And the grant said you could not sell this street off for a shopping chain or a highway or anything else commercial unless every last owner of record signed to allow it. Which meant Delvos did not need 7 of us. He did not need 8. He needed 9. One holdout was not a holdout. One holdout was a veto. One old woman who would not sign could stop the whole thing dead. And Odessa Pryor had already slammed her screen door in his face on the very first day. I sat on that floor a long time, because I saw 2 things at once, and they didn't fit together yet. The first was hope, sharp as anything. If we all just held, we won. It was that simple and that impossible, all 9 of us, holding, against a bounced check and a fresh grave and a soft-voiced man with money. Every week morning, between now and October. The second was the thing I couldn't square. Marta had signed. If Marta had sold her house, then the block was already broken. Then it was already only 8, and 8 was nothing. 8 lost. If Voss already had 1 clean signature, my beautiful old covenant was so much brittle paper. Did Marta sell her house? I got up off that floor with my knees aching and Harlan's field book in my hand, and I knew I could not sleep until I knew. But I couldn't ask Marta. She'd shut like Odessa's screen door. There was only one place in the county that would tell me the truth about what Marta Bellamy had actually signed, and that was the recorder's office in the courthouse basement. I went the next morning. I put on my church coat, because you go to the courthouse in your church coat, and I took Harlan's field book and the book and page numbers off the old grant, and I walked into town and down the courthouse stairs into that cool basement that smells of old paper and radiator dust. The clerk was a young woman named Ada Muncie. I knew her people a little. Muncie's from out past the creek, hard-working, close-mouthed, the good kind of quiet. She was maybe 34, with reading glasses pushed up in her hair, and she was the only soul down there. I told her what I needed. Not all of it. I told her I wanted to see the recorded covenant on the Elm Street plat, book such and such, page such and such, that my late husband had surveyed. And I told her, careful, that I wanted to see anything Crescent Development Group had filed against those lots this fall. Ada looked at me over those glasses, and I watched her decide something. A clerk hears everything, and she'd heard the name Crescent, and she'd maybe seen a few things cross her desk that sat wrong with her. She got up without a word and went back into the stacks. She brought the covenant book first, set it on the counter, and turned it to face me, and there it was, recorded, official, the same words I'd read on my closet floor, stamped and filed and real in the county's own book. All owners of record. My knees went a little soft with the relief of it. It wasn't just an old paper in a trunk. It was law. Then she went back, and she was gone longer, and she came out with a thinner folder, and she set it down and opened it, and she said the words that turned the whole thing over. "These aren't sales, Mrs. Ackerman." I said, "What?" "What Crescent's been filing." She turned the top sheet so I could read it. "They're not deeds of sale. They're options. 90-day purchase options." She tapped the paper with one finger. "See here. This is Mrs. Bellamy's." And there it was. Marta's signature, the one that had shamed her into silence. On an option. Not a deed. not a sale. Ada explained it to me the way you'd explain it to a neighbor, low and plain. An option isn't a sale. It's a promise to maybe sell, if certain things come true. And she showed me the certain things, printed right there in the contingency clause, the fine print none of us read because none of us were meant to. Every option was contingent on the same thing. Crescent had to deliver all 9 parcels. All 9 deeds, recorded, by October the 1st, so it could trigger its construction loan. That was the whole game. The chain wouldn't buy a broken block, and the bank wouldn't lend without the chain, and so Crescent's own contract said, in its own words, that if it did not have all 9 by October 1st, the whole thing came apart. And if they don't get all 9? I asked. I could barely say it. Then every option expires, Ada said. Void, on its own terms. Nobody's bound. No money changes hands. Mrs. Bellamy's is contingent just like the rest. She looked at me steady. She didn't sell her house, Mrs. Ackerman. She can walk away clean, and she doesn't even have to do anything. She just has to let October 1st come. I had to hold the edge of that counter. Marta hadn't sold. Marta had signed a promise that could only come true if all 9 of us fell, and all 9 of us were never going to fall. Because we didn't have to fall, we only had to stand still and let the calendar do the rest. The trap Voss built for us had a jaw that only closed if we walked into it together. And I was standing in the county basement, holding the key to all of it. Except October 1st. I looked at that date on the paper, and the second half of the truth came down on me. It cut both ways. If even one of us signed before October 1st, if he caught one more weak morning, one more bounce check, one more fresh grave, and got the 9th deed recorded in time, then all 9 came true at once. And the street was gone. The deadline was our shield and his sword, both. Whoever held the line to October 1st won everything. Whoever broke it lost everything. And there were 3 weeks between me and October, and 9 frightened widows, and a man who knew exactly which of us was closest to breaking. I thanked Ada Muncy. I don't think I did it well. She said, quiet, I didn't have to pull that Crescent file for you. You understand. And I understood. She'd stuck her neck out for a stranger in a church coat, because the thing was wrong, and she was the kind who couldn't abide a wrong thing crossing her desk. I told her I'd not forget it. I haven't. I walked home from the courthouse with the whole shape of it in my head at last, and it should have felt like winning, and it didn't. Because I could already see the next 3 weeks, and every soft place in our line. And I was right to worry. Because it started to come apart before I even got home good. It was Iris. Of course it was Iris. The newest, the rawest. When I got back to Elm Street, there was a knot of the women out front of her place, and Iris on her steps with a paper in her hand, white to the lips, and Voss's fine quiet car just pulling away down under the maples. He'd been back. The morning after the porch stand hadn't stopped him a day. He'd come back to Iris with the taxes. That's what the paper was. He'd brought her the actual tax assessment on the Kessler place, the real county number, and it was more than a woman on a canning plant widow's nothing could pay. And he'd set it in her hand and let her read her own ruin off it, and then, kind as a snake, told her his check would make it all go away. I can't pay this, Ruth, Iris said when she saw me. Her voice was a thread. Look at it, I can't. He's right. What am I holding on for? So they take it for taxes instead? At least, his way I get something. And I opened my mouth to tell her everything. The covenant, the options, October 1st, all of it. All the good news I'd carried up the courthouse stairs, and I looked at the other faces around her steps, and I stopped. Because 2 of them were looking at me wrong. Not all of them, but 2. Della Voss had gotten to more than Iris. There was a look going around that block that afternoon, and part of it was pointed at me, and the look said, "There's Ruth Ackerman come back from town again, poking, stirring, meddling, thinks she knows better than the rest of us, and what has knowing ever done for a widow but wear her out? Loretta Sims said it almost out loud. Some of us have to be practical, Ruth. Not everybody's got a county man's pension to sit on. Which stung, because it wasn't even true, but grief and fear make people reach for the nearest hard thing to throw. And under the maples, half a block down, that car had stopped. Just stopped, engine idling, and I knew Voss was in it, watching us cluster on Iris's steps. Watching the block argue with itself. And then his window went down, and he didn't even get out, he just called down the quiet street in that easy voice, so all of us would hear. That highway's coming through, whether you sign or not, ladies. County'll take it for a song. I'm the last good offer you'll see. A pause. Just long enough. Think about who's telling you different, and what she gets out of it. And the window went up. That's the kind of man he was. He didn't need to prove the highway was real. He only needed to put the fear next to my name and let people's own tiredness do the rest. Think about who's telling you different. He'd turned my warning into my crime. I stood there on the street I'd lived on for 41 years, with the covenant true in my head and the deadline running, and Marta free and clear, and none of them knowing it yet, and I felt the whole thing tilting toward loss. Iris a pen stroke from signing. 2 of my neighbors half turned against me. Marta somewhere behind her shut door, still believing she was already sold. And 3 weeks, only 3 weeks, and a man who'd be back on the next week morning. I could have argued on those steps. I could have poured it all out right there, loud, and had it come out as one meddling old woman raising her voice against a soft-spoken man with a county tax bill in his hand. And lost. I knew I'd lose it that way. Fear doesn't hear a shout. So I didn't shout. I went home instead. I want you to understand that going home was not giving up. Going home was me finally understanding what kind of fight this was. Because Del Voss had told me exactly who he was, back there by the diner. He counted on grief to isolate us. He believed a block never talks to itself. He believed each of us would sit alone behind our own shut door, and sign alone, and go under alone. One at a time, because that is the only way he'd ever seen widows do anything. Alone, and the whole answer, the entire answer, was to prove him wrong about that one thing. Not to out-argue him. Not to out-money him. Only to get 9 women who each thought they were alone into one room, and let them see they weren't. I sat at my kitchen table that night under Harlan's radio, and I did the only 2 things I know how to do. The things a surveyor's wife learns. You put it in writing. And you set the corners. I took out my good paper and my pen. And I wrote a letter to Del Voss. Not a neighborly note this time. A different kind of letter. Cold and exact. The kind you can't throw in a wastebasket and pretend you never saw. I wrote out the covenant. Book and page, word for word, all owners of record. I put him on notice, in plain county language, that Elm Street could not be consolidated for commercial development without every owner's written consent, and that consent would not be given. I dated it. I signed it my full name. And in the morning I was going to walk it to the post office and mail it certified, return receipt requested, so that his signature, or his refusal to sign for it, would be recorded in the United States Mail as the day Del Voss was told, past all deniability, that his deal was already dead. The same warning he threw in a wastebasket, made into a thing with teeth. Then I set the letter by the door, and I took down the tin cigar box off my own mantel, the one that smelled of King Edward's and held 41 years of my life, and I put it under my arm. Because a certified letter stops him on paper. But paper doesn't hold a street. People hold a street. And there were 8 other porches out there, in the dark. 8 women, each sitting alone behind a shut door, believing she was the only one left standing, or the first one folding, and not one of them knowing what I now knew. Tomorrow, before I mailed a thing, I was going to walk down Elm Street in the morning light with my deed under my arm, and I was going to knock on all 8 doors, and I was going to ask every last widow on this block to come sit on my porch. Odessa, who already had the spine. Marta, who had to be told she was free before she died of a shame she didn't owe. Iris, before that pen ever touched paper again. All of them, in one place, where they could look up and count each other, the way we counted each other the morning after Tom. I stood at my dark window a long while, with that tin box under my arm, looking down the street at all those quiet houses under the maples, and I'll be honest with you, my hands weren't steady. I was 63 years old, and one woman and I had 3 weeks, and I did not know if a single one of them would open the door to me in the morning, or whether I'd knock down that whole block and have every door stay shut, and stand alone on my own porch with a tin box and a letter, and be exactly the meddling old fool Voss had told them I was. I only knew I was going to knock. So I set the coffee for morning. I laid my church coat over the chair. And I put out 9 cups. Morning came gray and then gold. I put on my church coat. I carried the tin box down my own porch steps, and the dew was still on the grass, and I was more scared than I have been of anything since the doctor came out to tell me about Harlan. I started at Odessa's. She opened before I knocked twice. She had her housecoat on and a cigarette she never lit, just held, the way she'd done since her Vernon passed. She looked at the tin box under my arm, and she looked at my face. "Well," she said, "you finally came down off that porch. I need you, Odessa," I said. "I need all of you. On my porch. This morning. I found something." She didn't ask what. That was the thing about Odessa. She'd slammed her screen door in that man's face on the first day, and she'd been waiting 11 months for somebody else on this street to grow a spine to match hers. She just reached back inside for her own tin box off her own mantel, tucked it under her arm like a hymnal, and stepped out in her slippers. "Who's next?" she said. "We got them one by one. That's the only way it could have gone." 2 old women knocking, and behind each door a face that had learned to expect a man in a gray suit. But it wasn't him. It was us. And there is a thing that happens on a widow's face when she opens her door braced for a check and a pen, and finds instead a neighbor she has known for 30 years, holding the same tin box she keeps on her own mantel. Something lets go in the shoulders. Something that has been held a long time. Marta Bellamy wouldn't come at first. She stood in her doorway with her arms crossed over her sweater, and she wouldn't look at me. "I already signed, Ruth," she said, low, so the street wouldn't hear. "It's done. I did a foolish thing, and it's done, and I don't need the whole block on a porch to watch me be ashamed of it." "Marta," I said, "you didn't sell your house." She went still. "You didn't sell it. I've seen the papers. Down at the courthouse. What you signed wasn't a deed. Come to my porch and let me show you what you actually signed, and if I'm wrong you can go home and never speak to me again." But I'm not wrong. She came. She came with her tin box held against her chest like it might get away from her. Iris Kessler was last, at the far end, in the house where Tom's linotype pay had kept the lights on for 30 years. She'd buried him 3 weeks. She opened the door, and I saw the pen still on the hall table by the funeral guest book, and I saw the Prince Albert tin on the mantel behind her, with her deed in it, and I saw a woman about to sign her whole life away out of nothing but the fear of being a burden. "Iris," I said, "don't sign anything. Come sit with us first. That's all I ask. Sit first, sign after, if you still want to. But sit first." She looked past me. She saw them. Odessa and Marta and the others, coming up the walk in the morning light, each one carrying that same little tin box. And Iris Kessler put her hand over her mouth, and she came. 9 cups. I'd set out 9, and I filled every one. They sat on my porch in the good chairs, and the kitchen chairs I'd dragged out. And I stood by the rail with Harlan's field book and the oilcloth folder from the trunk, and I told them. I told them about the plat, how Harlan set every corner of this street in 1949 with his own transit, the one still in its case in my hall. How before that, back in 1890-something, when the whole block was cut from the Pettigrew farm, the man who founded it wrote a line into the founding grant. And I read them the line. I read it slow. The lots shall not be consolidated or conveyed for commercial development, save by the written consent of all owners of record. I let that sit. All, I said. Not most. Not 7 of 9. All, every last one of us has to sign, or it doesn't happen. One no from any porch on this street. And Mr. Voss has nothing. He doesn't need to beat us. He needs to beat all of us. And he can't, because he only has to lose once. Odessa laughed, one short hard sound, like a door closing right. But it was Marta I was watching. Marta with her arms still crossed. So I opened the folder from the courthouse, the copy Ada had made me, and I laid it on the table where she could see. Marta, what you signed is right here. It's called a 90-day option, not a sale. It says Crescent can buy your house if, and only if, they get all 9 by October the 1st. If even one of us holds, your option expires. It turns to nothing. No money changes hands. You keep your house, and you owe them not one dime. Read it. Read your own name on it. You didn't sell, honey, you never sold. I have seen people get news at that table. Bad news, mostly, over the years. That was the first time I ever watched someone get a thing back they thought was gone forever. Marta Bellamy put both hands flat on my table, and she bowed her head down over that paper, and she cried the way you cry when you set down something you've been carrying up a hill too long. I thought I'd lost Cal's house, she said. I thought I'd handed it to that man for $8,400, and I was too ashamed to tell a living soul. You didn't lose anything, Odessa said. None of us did. Not yet. Not unless we're fool enough to. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, well, we hadn't. Not the first time. But we were reading it now, 9 of us, on a porch, out loud. That's when it turned from a fear into a plan. We agreed on the hard part first, and it was Odessa who said it. He can't know, she said. The minute Voss knows we've all sat down together and figured it, he'll come at us harder. He'll pick the weakest door and lean on it till it opens. So we don't tell him a thing. We let him think it's working. We let him think grief's still doing his job for him. And we let that clock run down to October the 1st, while he's smiling. So that's what we did. We went back to our porches. We waved at him the same tired way. When his gray car rolled slow down Elm Street, we looked away like beaten women. And every Thursday we met, in a different kitchen each time. Never the same house twice. So it looked like nothing but old friends and pie. Ada Muncy helped us from the inside, and she took a risk doing it that I won't ever forget. She pulled the covenant book and photographed the page. She copied every one of the 9 option filings on the recorder's machine after hours. 34 years old, that girl, with a county paycheck she couldn't lose, and she stood at that machine in the dark and copied papers that could have cost her the job, because her own grandmother had been a widow that a man in a suit once talked out of a farm. My grandmother didn't have a covenant, Ada told me, handing me the folder. You do. Use it. He nearly caught us twice. The first time was a Sunday. We were in my kitchen, all 9, and I looked up from the table, and there was the gray car parked dead across the street, and Del Voss behind the wheel, just watching my house. My heart went up into my throat. Odessa saw my face and turned and saw it too, and quiet as anything she stood up and started clearing plates and said, loud enough to carry through the screen, Ruth, this is the best peach pie you have made in a year, now don't argue with me. And she carried a plate right out onto the porch in plain sight, and set it on the rail and licked her thumb an old woman having Sunday pie with her friends, and after a while the gray car pulled away. We were only having pie. That's all anybody saw. The second time was worse, because it wasn't about us. It was about Ada. Word got to Voss somehow that a clerk had been pulling the Covenant book. He went to the recorder himself and made a noise about misuse of county records, and for a day and a half that girl thought she was going to be fired for helping us. She called me from a payphone with her voice shaking. And I did the one thing I still knew how to do. I called a man named Harlan, had surveyed alongside for 20 years, a man who'd gone on to sit as a county judge before he retired, and I asked him would he make one telephone call. He did. He called the recorder and he said, mild as milk, that any covenant recorded in that courthouse was a public document, and that a clerk pulling a public document was doing her sworn job, and that if anyone wanted to make it a matter he would be very interested to attend. Ada kept her job. And that old judge told me on the phone, before he hung up, Ruthie, that covenant's ironclad. 1911 language, recorded, unbroken, your Harlan surveyed to it his whole career. That man Voss is trying to sell a thing he was never going to be allowed to buy. Voss got meaner as the calendar thinned. He came with a final offer and a 10-day fuse, going door to door, and he raised his numbers, and he dropped his voice, and to every porch he murmured the same poison. The highway's coming through here anyway. The county'll condemn the whole street for pennies. Sell to me, at least you get something. Hold out and you'll get a government check for half of what I'm offering, and you'll have made an enemy of me for nothing. He said it to Marta, and I watched her waver on her own porch, her hand halfway to the door. And I watched Iris Kessler, Iris, the newest widow, the one he'd figured to be softest, walk across 2 yards in her apron and take Marta by the elbow, and say, right in front of him, Marta Bellamy, you come have coffee. We are not doing business on porches anymore on this street. And she walked her away. And Del Voss stood there in the yard with his 10-day fuse and watched the softest widow on Elm Street turn to iron in front of his eyes, and I don't think he understood yet what he was looking at. He thought grief made people alone. That was the whole of his trade. He never once considered that it might make them hold on to each other harder. The night it all came together was a Tuesday at dusk, and we did it on Odessa Pryor's front porch, because Odessa had been the first to say no, and it was right that it happen on her boards. The light through her screen door was warm and gold from the kitchen behind. The maples were just starting to turn at the tips. And one by one, 9 women came up the walk in the last of the light, and each one carried her tin box. We set them on the table. All 9. King Edward's and Prince Albert, and one old candy tin gone rusty at the seams, whatever each woman had used for whatever years. And one by one we opened them, and one by one we took out the deeds, and we laid them flat on Odessa's porch table in the gold light. 9 deeds side by side. And there it was, on every single one, down in the corner, the same seal. The 1911 seal from the founding grant, pressed into all 9 when the block was born, the mark Harlan had surveyed to, and I had never once looked at close in 41 years. 9 deeds, 1 seal, 1 street. I put my finger on Harlan's field book, and I read the covenant out loud one more time, in front of all of them, in the dark. And the crickets were going, and the light was warm, and when I got to the word, every woman on that porch said it with me. All owners of record. We were not 9 grieving women. We had been 9 grieving women, alone, each behind her own shut door, and that is exactly what he had counted on. But laid out on that table, in the lamplight, we were one thing he could not buy, and could not scare, and could not outweight. We were 1 veto with 9 names on it. We wrote a pledge that night. Odessa's granddaughter had a good hand, and she wrote it out plain, that not 1 lot on Elm Street would sell, and we all signed it, 9 names down the page, and each woman took her deed home and put it back in her tin box on her mantel where it belonged. And here's the part I keep. When we stood up to go, Iris Kessler stood at the porch rail a minute, looking down the street at all our dark houses under the maples. And she said, quiet, "Tom used to say a linotype line is only strong because every letter locks the next one." She touched the deed in her tin box. I didn't understand that till tonight. Del Vos was parked at the end of the block. We saw the gray car. He'd followed one of us. Or he'd just sensed it, the way a man senses the tide going out from under him. And he sat there and he watched 9 widows come off that porch together, unhurried, unafraid, each carrying a little tin box, and I believe that was the moment he knew. Not October the 1st. That Tuesday. He knew he was already too late, and there was not one thing left in his bag to do about it. October the 1st came on a Wednesday. We heard how it went from Ada, who heard it from the courthouse, which heard it from the city. Crescent's whole deal rested on a construction loan, and that loan had a condition written right into it, all 9 parcels recorded to Crescent by October the 1st, or no money. That morning, a man from the bank came to record 9 deeds. There were no 9 deeds. There were no deeds at all. There was one street of widows who had every last one of theirs sitting in a tin box on a mantel. So the contingency failed. The bank withdrew the loan, and the minute that loan was gone, every option Crescent held turned to paper and dust, expired, void, worth nothing. Exactly as the fine print always said they would if he couldn't get all 9. Voss's bonus was gone. And his boss, that man Gaines, who'd sat in a car outside a diner and said grief did half his job, his promotion went right along with it. Not $1 changed hands on Elm Street. Not one. Every woman kept her house. Marta Bellamy kept Cal's house. Free and clear. $8,400 unspent because she'd never actually spent it. And the maples turned, the way they do, gold and then red, over 9 houses that were still standing and still ours. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Because a man like that has to come and look at the thing that beat him. They can't help it. Voss came to my porch on a Saturday, and he came with his hat in his hand. Literally in his hand. That slick, gray suit looked slept in, and the smile was gone. "Mrs. Ackerman," he said, "I've come to make things right. I had iced tea already made, because I'd figured he'd come, and I poured him a glass and set it on the rail. He never touched it. I'm authorized to offer you triple," he said. "All of you. $54,000 a house. That's more than any of these places will ever be worth. And you know it. Name your price, Mrs. Ackerman. Whatever number gets this done. Name it." I sat in Harlan's chair, and I looked at him a while. He was younger than I'd thought, up close. He'd have been a boy when Harlan was setting the corners of this street. "You needed all 9, Mr. Voss," I said. "You got none. That's not a negotiation. That's arithmetic." "Mrs. Ackerman, you want to know your price?" I reached into my apron and I took out the certified letter. The one I'd mailed him in September. The one that had come back to me marked refused, because he'd never signed for it. I slid it across the table, still sealed, my own handwriting on the front, the book and page of the covenant listed right there under the address. "There's your receipt," I said. "You had your warning in July, on a neighborly note you threw in a basket. You had it again in September, certified, and you wouldn't even sign for it. I told you twice this street was one plat, not 9 houses. You didn't read the fine print, Mr. Voss, and you're a man who sells fine print for a living." He looked at that envelope a long time. Then he put his hat back on, and he walked down my steps, and he didn't drink the tea, and that was the last time Del Vos ever set foot on Elm Street. The reckoning proper happened in November, in the VFW hall, at the county zoning hearing, and I want to tell you about that room because it was the same town that had watched Iris get a check laid over her husband's guest book, and it was right that the town should watch this too. Every porch on Elm Street filled a chair. 9 women in their good coats, in a row. And behind us, half of Marrow Creek, because word travels in a town that size, and folks wanted to see it. Crescent had a lawyer and Gaines came in from the city, and Voss sat at their table looking like a man at his own sentencing. And it was quiet. That's the thing I remember. No shouting. Just documents on a table. They called Voss up to explain Crescent's plan for the street, and the county's lawyer had him read aloud from Crescent's own filing, the financing agreement, the part that said in Crescent's own words that the whole thing was contingent on all 9 parcels, all or nothing, by October the 1st. He had to read it himself, out loud, into the record. His own trap, in his own mouth. And when he finished, I stood up. They let me speak, being a party of record, and I didn't raise my voice. I read one thing into that record. I read what I'd heard through a car window outside the diner in late summer, the thing his own boss had said where Voss could hear it. Widows sign faster than they read. Grief does half my job for me. Get me Elm Street by October. I read it plain, and I sat back down, and I looked at Cyrus Gaines while I did it. And the whole hall was so quiet you could hear the radiator tick. Gaines never spoke a word in that room. He didn't have to. It was on his face. Within the month, his own board of directors let him go. A covenant is a technicality money erases, he'd always figured, and it had cost his company a small fortune and a great deal of the wrong kind of newspaper. I heard later somebody saw him selling his own car in the city. One sentence is all he gets from me. He was a man who thought a street would never talk to itself. And he was wrong. There was a councilman, too, who'd been quietly on Crescent's payroll and had been greasing the highway rumor. The next spring he came up for election, and the count came in, and Marrow Creek read it out like a verdict. He didn't come close. And at the end of that hearing, the county judge, Harlan's old friend, the one who'd made the phone call, he confirmed the 1911 covenant on the public record, permanent, unbreakable, for as long as those 9 lots stand. He looked over his glasses at our row of coats, and he said, "The covenant holds. It always held." And he brought down the gavel one time, soft, and it was done. No shouting. Documents on a table. That's how the quiet people win, when they finally read the fine print out loud. It's October again now, a year on. I'm on my porch, and the maples are turning, and if you stand at my rail at dusk, you can count 9 porch lights all down Elm Street, warm in the blue, not one of them dark. Iris Kessler's got grandchildren on her porch swing most evenings, and you can hear them from here. Marta Bellamy framed her husband's pension letter and hung it in her front room, right next to her deed. The 2 things she almost lost, side by side on the wall where she has to walk past them every day. Odessa still won't light that cigarette. Some things a person just keeps. There's a young family moving into the old Kessler place down the far end. Iris moved in with her daughter over on Fremont, and she sold her house herself to a young couple with a baby for a fair price and a handshake, with her own blessing and not one man's check. She said she wanted a child growing up in Tom's house. First thing that couple did was put a light on the porch. Harlan's original 1911 plat, the founding one, hangs framed on the wall of the recorder's office in town now. Ada Muncy put it there. She said the county ought to be able to see what a street looks like when it's drawn to be kept. I go and look at it sometimes. It's just lines and a seal, and my husband's kind of careful. But I know what it holds. They tell me Del Voss sells insurance now, 2 counties over, door to door. I hope, for the sake of the folks who open those doors, that he has finally learned to read his own fine print. Gaines I never heard another word about, and that's all the words he'll get. I've thought a lot, this past year, about why it almost worked. And I think it's this. Grief was the only lock that man knew how to pick. He was good at it, too. He knew a woman alone in a quiet house, the week after the funeral, would sign near anything to make the fear stop. He counted on us being alone. He counted on 9 shut doors and 9 women, each certain she was the only one still standing. What he never counted on, what a man like that can't imagine, is that a block of widows might keep one another's keys. That the same grief he came to use against us was the very thing that had already tied us together, years back, at every one of each other's funerals. 1 casserole and 1 held hand at a time. He thought we were 9 locks. We were 1 door, and we all had the key. So that's my street. 9 narrow houses under old maples, cut from the Pettigrew farm, surveyed by my Harlan's own hands, and still standing, every one. If you got this far, do me a small kindness. Comment the name of the street you grew up on. I want to see how far Elm Street travels. Because somewhere out there is another quiet block, and another woman alone behind a shut door, thinking she's the only one left standing, and she isn't. She never was. She just hasn't opened the door to her neighbors yet. Let me tell you what the October after proved it. Ada called on a Wednesday, the 1st of that month. I was hanging laundry out back when the phone rang, and she said it so quietly I made her say it twice. The night before, Crescent Development Group's construction loan had been called due to an unmet assemblage contingency. 9 parcels required. 9 parcels not recorded. Every option expired void. Not 1 widow owed a dime. Not 1 signature was enforceable. The line went so still after she finished that I could hear the maple out front moving in the wind. The one Harlan planted the year we moved in. And I said thank you, and hung up and sat down on the back step and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not out of sadness. Out of relief so heavy, it felt like weight. 3 days later, Del Vos came back. He drove up in the same gray car, but with something different in the set of his shoulders. He had his hat in his hand. Actually in his hand, actually off his head. His collar was loose in a way it never had been before. He said he'd like to talk. I said I'd make iced tea. I set it on the table between us, and I did not pour him any. He made his offer. "Triple," he said. "Name your price, Mrs. Ackerman. 54,000 a house if the block would come to the table and forget the summer's unpleasantness." I let him finish. I listened the way you listen to weather that has already passed. Then I reached into my apron pocket and laid his own certified letter on the table in front of him, the one I had mailed in August, the one he'd never signed for. The one that came back to me with the return receipt card still blank. I said, "You needed 9, Misty. Voss, you got none. That isn't a negotiation. That's arithmetic. There's your receipt." He looked at that envelope a good while. He left his iced tea untouched and drove away. I poured it on the rosebush. The zoning hearing was November. The VFW hall on Prospect Street packed so full they had to open the back doors, and people stood out on the steps. Every porch on Elm Street had emptied itself into those folding chairs, and half of Marrow Creek besides. Judge Renner, retired now, but Harlan's old friend from the survey days, sat to the right of the podium and confirmed on the public record that the 1911 Pettigrew Covenant was valid and perpetual, filed under the book and page that Ada Muncy had pulled 3 months before at the cost of several conversations with her supervisor that I gathered were not pleasant. That supervisor was on Crescent's payroll. He lost his re-election bid the following spring. I am told he blamed the weather. Someone read Crescent's own filing into the record, the all-or-nothing assemblage contingency, printed on their letterhead, signed by Cyrus Gaines. Then, someone read back what Gaines had said in the car outside the diner, with Voss in the passenger seat. "Widows sign faster than they read. Grief does half my job for me." It was read at an ordinary volume, because the room was that quiet. Nobody had to raise their voice. Documents on a table, and no man in the room willing to look at the one beside him. Gaines was dismissed by his own board inside the month. I heard he sold his car. That was the year. Now it is October again, the true October, 1973, and I am sitting on my front porch with a cup of coffee going cold because I keep watching the street instead of drinking it. Iris's grandchildren are on her front swing, the two little ones, feet not yet reaching the porch boards. She is watching them through the screen door with that loose, unguarded look a woman gets when she is not bracing for anything. Marta Bellamy's pension check is framed now, the October one, the first one that came in full since Cal's policy settled. She showed me on a Tuesday. It hangs beside her deed on the wall by the kitchen window, and she does not look away from it the way she used to. There is a young family in the Kessler place. Iris sold it herself, at her own price, to a couple with a baby and a dog and a second-hand sofa that needed 3 of us to carry up the steps. It took 10 minutes. The maples are the color of old copper coins tonight. A cat is sleeping on Odessa Pryor's step. Somewhere down the block a screen door opens and closes, and I think I can smell whatever Marta has on the stove. 9 porch lights on Elm Street. Harlan would have liked this October.